I used to believe that if a man worked hard enough, loved deeply enough, and stayed quiet about his own pain, everything would eventually turn out fine. I believed that sacrifice was a language children understood without explanation. I believed that giving up your dreams for your family was not a loss, but a trade. A fair one. I was wrong about more things than I can count, but I didn't realize that until the night my son walked out of my house and left behind a silence so heavy it felt like it had weight. It happened on a night that looked ordinary from the outside. No storms, no shouting, no dramatic warning signs. Just a quiet evening that slowly turned into the moment that changed how I see my life, my choices, and myself. I still replay that night in my head, not because I enjoy the pain, but because part of me believes that if I examine every word and every pause closely enough, I might understand where everything truly went wrong. I remember sitting at the kitchen table long after midnight, staring at a mug of coffee that had gone cold. The house was too quiet. The kind of quiet that feels wrong, like something is missing. My son's room was dark. His shoes were gone from the hallway. And with him went a part of me I didn't even know I had been holding on to. That was the night I learned that love, when mixed with silence and sacrifice, can turn into something fragile. Something that looks strong on the outside but breaks easily when tested. That night revealed a family secret I never expected to uncover, one that had been growing quietly for years while I convinced myself everything was fine. To understand that night, you have to understand who I was before it happened. You have to understand the choices I made and the dreams I buried without telling anyone. Because none of this began with my son leaving. It began decades earlier, with a younger version of me who believed that doing the right thing always meant letting go of what you wanted most. I grew up in a small house where money was always tight and words were even tighter. My father was a good man, but he believed emotions were private things. You worked, you provided, and you kept your worries to yourself. That was how he showed love. My mother was softer, but tired. Life had a way of pressing down on her until she moved through the days quietly, like she was careful not to take up too much space. As a boy, I learned early that being dependable mattered more than being happy. Praise came when chores were done, when grades were good, when I didn't complain. Dreams were something you kept in your head, not something you spoke out loud. Still, I had them. Big ones. I wanted to create things. I wanted to build a life that felt meaningful, not just responsible. When I was young, I dreamed of being an architect. I loved drawing buildings, imagining spaces where people could live and feel safe. I stayed up late sketching designs on scrap paper, telling myself that one day I would study, travel, and build something that would last longer than I would. For a while, that dream felt possible. I was good in school. Teachers noticed. They encouraged me. Then life stepped in, the way it always does. My father got sick during my last year of high school. Suddenly, my future felt less important than keeping the lights on. I took a job instead of going away to college. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself dreams could wait. That was the first time I made that kind of promise to myself. It would not be the last. Years passed faster than I expected. One job turned into another. Responsibilities stacked up quietly. I met my wife, a kind woman with tired eyes and a gentle voice. She made life feel warmer, safer. When we talked about the future, I focused on stability. A steady paycheck, a house, a family. Those were the things I knew how to provide. When she got pregnant with our son, I felt something shift inside me. Fear, yes, but also purpose. I told myself that from that moment on, my life was no longer about me. It was about him, about giving him everything I never had. I said those words out loud, proud of them. I didn't realize then that I was also quietly saying goodbye to the rest of my dreams. Our son was born on a cold morning. I remember holding him, feeling how small and fragile he was, and promising him a better life. I promised without understanding the cost of that promise. I worked longer hours. I took promotions I didn't enjoy because they paid more. I came home tired and told myself that my exhaustion was proof of love. As he grew, I measured my success by practical things. Was there food on the table? A roof over our heads? School supplies paid for? I believed those were the things that mattered most. I believed that love lived in actions, not words. I didn't say, "I love you" often. I showed it by being there, by paying bills, by fixing what broke. But children don't always read love the way adults expect them to. My son was quiet as a child, thoughtful. He spent a lot of time alone, reading or drawing. Sometimes I would pause in the doorway of his room and watch him, wondering what he was thinking. I wanted to ask, but the words never came. I told myself that giving him space was respect. I didn't realize it also created distance. As he grew older, I noticed changes. He spoke less at dinner. He answered questions with short replies. His eyes held something I didn't understand. I assumed it was normal teenage moodiness. I assumed it would pass. I was busy, always busy, providing, sacrificing, telling myself this was what good fathers did. The truth is, I was afraid of conversations that might reveal things I didn't know how to fix. I was afraid of hearing that my best wasn't enough. So I stayed quiet. I stayed practical. I stayed distant, without meaning to. The night everything broke open didn't start with an argument. It started with a question. My son stood in the doorway of the living room, hands in his pockets, shoulders tense. I could see he was nervous. I turned down the television and waited. There was a long pause. I should have said something kind. I should have invited him in. Instead, I waited, expecting him to speak. He asked me if I was happy. The question caught me off guard. I laughed lightly, the way people do when they don't know how to answer honestly. I told him happiness wasn't the point. That providing for your family was what mattered. That life wasn't about chasing dreams. I didn't see his face fall right away. I didn't notice how carefully he chose his next words. He asked me if I ever regretted giving up what I wanted. I felt something tighten in my chest. Regret was not a word I allowed myself to use. I told him no. I told him sacrifice was part of being a man. I told him I would do it all again. That was when he looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw something I hadn't seen before. Not anger, not disrespect, just sadness. Deep, quiet sadness. He told me that he didn't want my life. He told me he felt like I had taught him how to survive, but not how to live. He told me he felt invisible in his own home. I wanted to respond. I wanted to explain myself. But all the words I had practiced in my head over the years failed me. I sat there, silent, while my son stood in front of me, waiting for something I didn't know how to give. That silence was the moment everything began to fall apart. He left later that night, packed a bag, said he needed space, said he didn't know when he would be back. I watched him walk out the door, convinced he would return in a few days. I told myself it was just a phase. I didn't yet understand that this was not just about that night. It was about years of quiet misunderstandings, years of love expressed in ways he couldn't feel, years of dreams buried so deep they turned into unspoken expectations. As I sat alone in the kitchen afterward, I felt something I had avoided for most of my life. Regret, not loud or dramatic, just a soft ache that settled into my chest and refused to leave. That was the night my son walked away. And it was the night I began to realize that giving up my dreams may have taught him to give up his feelings. That realization would change everything I thought I knew about family, sacrifice, and love. And I was only beginning to uncover the truth. When my son walked out that night, I told myself I had time. Time to fix things. Time to explain. Time to let emotions cool down. I believed distance would soften the edges of what had been said. I believed he would come back once he realized that life outside our home was harder than he imagined. That belief helped me sleep during those first few nights, but it didn't last. The house felt different the next morning. Not empty exactly, but unsettled. Like furniture had been moved slightly out of place, even though everything looked the same. I went through my routine on autopilot. Made coffee, read the news, got dressed for work. Every step felt normal, but none of it felt real. I kept expecting to hear his footsteps in the hallway or his door opening. Each time I remembered he wasn't there, my chest tightened. On the drive to work, memories began to surface. Not the big ones, but small moments I had dismissed over the years. Times when he tried to talk, and I was too tired. Times when he showed me his drawings, and I nodded without really looking. Times when he asked questions about life, and I answered with responsibility instead of curiosity. I pushed those thoughts away. I told myself every parent misses things. That didn't mean I had failed. For most of my life, I measured myself by effort, not outcome. If I worked hard, I believed that was enough. If my intentions were good, the results would follow. I never stopped to ask whether my family experienced my love the way I believed I was giving it. I met my wife later that evening in the kitchen. She had been quieter than usual since our son left. I noticed dark circles under her eyes. She asked if I had heard from him. I shook my head. We stood there for a moment, surrounded by words neither of us wanted to say. Eventually, she sighed and returned to cooking dinner for 2 instead of 3. That simple change hurt more than I expected. My wife and I had built our marriage on practicality. We didn't argue much. We didn't talk deeply either. We shared responsibilities, not emotions. For years, that felt like stability. Now it felt like distance. I realized we had been living parallel lives, focused on survival instead of connection. That night, I lay awake thinking about how our family had come to this point. The truth was uncomfortable. I had been so focused on being a provider that I forgot how to be present. I believed love meant protection from hardship. I didn't understand that emotional absence could be its own kind of hardship. When our son was younger, I rarely missed work events. I told myself that promotions mattered, that overtime mattered, that security mattered. I missed school plays, parent meetings, small moments that seemed unimportant at the time. Each sacrifice felt justified. Each absence felt temporary. I never imagined they would add up. I remember one afternoon when he was about 10 years old. He had waited all day to show me a model building he had made for school. When I came home late, exhausted, he was still awake, sitting at the table. He explained every detail with excitement in his voice. I listened, but my mind was elsewhere. I told him it was good, patted his shoulder, and went to bed. I didn't see the disappointment in his eyes until years later, when I replayed that memory with clarity I didn't have then. He was more like me than I realized. Quiet, thoughtful, full of ideas he didn't know how to express. Instead of seeing myself in him, I saw responsibility. I saw the future I needed to secure. I didn't see a child who needed reassurance that his thoughts mattered. After he left, days turned into weeks. I sent him messages that went unanswered. Short ones, safe ones. Hope you're okay. Let me know if you need anything. I avoided emotional language. I told myself I was giving him space. The truth was, I didn't know how to reach him without exposing feelings I had buried for decades. Work became a refuge. It always had been. I stayed late, took on extra tasks, focused on problems that had clear solutions. Numbers made sense. Deadlines could be met. Emotions didn't follow rules. They demanded attention and honesty. I wasn't ready for that. One evening, my wife asked me if I thought we had done something wrong. The question made me uncomfortable. I told her we did our best, that no family was perfect. She nodded, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. She told me she worried that our son felt unseen. I felt defensive. I reminded her of everything we had provided. The house, the education, the stability. She didn't argue. She just looked tired. That was the first time I wondered if my definition of love was incomplete. I started noticing how quiet the house had always been. Even when our son lived with us. We didn't laugh loudly. We didn't argue loudly either. Everything was controlled. Polite. Calm on the surface. Underneath, emotions stayed hidden. I had grown up that way. I thought it was normal. I didn't realize it could feel cold to someone who needed warmth. Weeks later, my son finally answered one of my messages. He said he was safe, that he needed time, that he wasn't angry, just tired. Tired was a word that stayed with me. It sounded like something deeper than frustration. It sounded like exhaustion built over years. I wanted to ask him what he was tired of. I wanted to apologize. Instead, I replied that I understood, that I was there when he was ready. Again, I chose distance over vulnerability. At work, younger colleagues talked about purpose and fulfillment. I listened quietly. I remembered the dreams I once had. Architecture, creation, meaning. I wondered what might have happened if I had pursued them. The thought brought guilt. I had built my life on sacrifice. Questioning it felt like betrayal. One afternoon, I found an old notebook in the garage. It was filled with sketches from my youth, buildings I had imagined, notes about design and space. My handwriting was confident, hopeful. I sat on the floor and turned the pages slowly. I felt like I was reading the thoughts of a stranger, someone who believed his ideas mattered. That night, I realized something painful. I hadn't just given up my dreams. I had quietly mourned them for years without acknowledging the loss. That unspoken grief had shaped me. It had made me cautious, reserved, afraid of wanting too much. Without meaning to, I had passed that fear to my son. I began to see how my sacrifices might have taught him that happiness was optional, that dreams were dangerous, that expressing desire led to disappointment. I had wanted to protect him. Instead, I may have taught him to limit himself. As days passed, the silence between us grew heavier. My wife and I spoke less. Meals felt mechanical. I noticed how often she stared at her phone, hoping for a message. I realized she had been emotionally present in ways I had not. She had listened when I worked. She had worried quietly when I dismissed concerns. One evening, she told me she had spoken to our son. She didn't share details, just said he felt pressure growing up. Pressure to be responsible, to be grateful, to not complain. Those words felt familiar. They were the same expectations I placed on myself. I wanted to deny it. Instead, I listened. That night, I admitted something to myself I had avoided for years. I had confused endurance with strength, silence with stability, sacrifice with love. Those things mattered, but they were not enough on their own. The realization didn't bring relief. It brought sadness. For the man I used to be, for the boy my son had been, for the conversations we never had. I began to understand that the night he walked away wasn't an act of rebellion. It was an act of survival. He wasn't rejecting me. He was searching for space to breathe. That understanding hurt more than anger would have. I still didn't know how to fix things. I only knew that continuing the same way would change nothing. The walls I had built to protect my family had also kept them at a distance. And slowly, painfully, I began to see that the secret revealed that night wasn't about my son at all. It was about me. After the realization settled in that the silence between my son and me was not an accident, I found myself standing in unfamiliar territory. For most of my life, problems had solutions. You worked harder. You adjusted your schedule. You saved more. You planned better. But this problem did not respond to effort alone. It demanded honesty, and honesty was something I had never practiced openly. I started paying attention to my thoughts in a way I never had before. They moved slowly, carefully, like they were afraid of being noticed. I realized how often I stopped myself from feeling too much. How quickly I dismissed sadness or longing as weakness. Those habits were not new. They had been with me since childhood, shaped by a world that valued resilience over vulnerability. I remembered being a boy and crying quietly in my room after my father told me to stop daydreaming and focus on real life. He wasn't cruel. He was practical. But his words taught me that feelings were distractions. That wanting more than survival was irresponsible. I learned to swallow disappointment and move on. I learned to be dependable. No one taught me how to be emotionally present. Those lessons stayed with me into adulthood. They shaped my marriage, my work, and my parenting. I believed that if I avoided conflict and stayed steady, everything would work out. I didn't see how avoidance could slowly erode connection. As days turned into months, I noticed how empty my evenings felt. Without my son's quiet presence, the house echoed with unspoken questions. I found myself sitting in his room, surrounded by things that revealed parts of him I hadn't known. Books with notes scribbled in the margins. Sketches taped inside drawers. Ideas he never shared with me. Each discovery felt like a small confession. A reminder that he had a rich inner world that existed beyond my understanding. I felt ashamed that I had been so close physically, yet so far emotionally. I wanted to reach out to him. I rehearsed conversations in my head. I imagined telling him I was proud of him, that I admired his sensitivity, that I regretted my distance. But when it came time to speak, my words felt stiff, unnatural. I worried I would say the wrong thing. I worried I would make things worse. Fear kept me quiet. Fear disguised itself as patience. One afternoon, my wife asked me if I had ever told our son why I worked so much. The question surprised me. I told her it was obvious. She shook her head gently and said children often create their own explanations when adults don't explain themselves. That idea unsettled me. I wondered what story my son had told himself about my absence. Had he believed he wasn't important enough? Had he assumed my distance was a reflection of his worth? The thought made my chest ache. That evening, I finally decided to write him a letter. Not a message, not a short text. A letter. Something slower. Something honest. I sat at the table for hours, staring at a blank page. Every sentence felt heavy. I didn't know where to begin. When the words finally came, they were awkward. I told him about my childhood, about the dreams I never pursued, about the fear that guided my choices. I admitted that I had confused providing with loving. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I didn't justify my actions. I simply told the truth as best I could. Writing that letter was harder than any job I had ever done. It forced me to confront parts of myself I had avoided. It forced me to feel regret without hiding behind responsibility. I mailed the letter and waited. Waiting felt unbearable. Days passed without a response. I reminded myself that honesty didn't guarantee repair. That truth didn't erase hurt. Still, I hoped. In the meantime, I began to reflect on my marriage with new eyes. My wife had spent years supporting me quietly. She had carried emotional weight without asking for much in return. I realized how often I had mistaken her patience for contentment. I began to listen more, to ask questions, to stay present during conversations instead of retreating into my thoughts. We talked late into the night about our fears, our disappointments, our hopes for our son. Those conversations were not dramatic. They were gentle, careful, healing in small ways. I learned that vulnerability did not weaken me. It softened me. Weeks later, my son finally replied to my letter. His response was brief but thoughtful. He thanked me for writing. He said it helped him understand me better. He admitted he had felt pressure to live a life of obligation rather than passion. He said he needed time to figure out who he was without expectations. I read his words over and over. They hurt, but they also brought clarity. He wasn't running away from me. He was running toward himself. I realized then that my silence had taught him to carry his emotions alone, just as I had learned to do. The cycle was clear. It had passed from one generation to the next without anyone noticing. That realization came with responsibility. If I wanted things to change, I had to change first. Not with grand gestures, but with consistent honesty. I had to learn how to express care without hiding behind duty. I began to speak differently at work. I shared ideas I once kept to myself. I allowed myself to be seen as more than reliable. Those changes felt small, but they mattered. They reminded me that it was never too late to reclaim parts of yourself. As months passed, my son and I spoke occasionally. The conversations were careful, respectful, honest in ways they had never been before. We didn't rush reconciliation. We allowed space for growth. I learned that love doesn't always look like sacrifice. Sometimes it looks like presence, like listening, like allowing someone to be different from the life you imagined for them. One evening, as I sat alone reflecting on the journey so far, I understood something important. The night my son walked away had not been the end of our relationship. It had been the beginning of a more truthful one. I still carried regret, but it no longer felt paralyzing. It felt instructive. It guided me toward a version of myself I was still learning to become. The secret that night revealed was not just about my family. It was about the cost of unspoken dreams and unexpressed love, and the courage it takes to finally speak. After my son replied to my letter, something inside me shifted. Not in a dramatic way. There was no sudden relief or sense of victory. It was quieter than that, like the slow easing of a tight muscle you didn't realize you'd been clenching for years. His words didn't erase the past, but they gave it shape. They made it understandable. And once something is understood, it can no longer hide in the dark. Still, the days that followed were not easy. Growth rarely is. I was learning how to live without the familiar armor of silence. I had spent most of my life being careful, controlled, and predictable. Now I was being asked to sit with discomfort, to acknowledge feelings without rushing to fix them. That was unfamiliar ground. I noticed how often I reached for old habits. When something felt uncertain, my instinct was to retreat into work or routine. Those patterns had served me well for decades. They gave me a sense of order. Letting go of them felt like standing without support. Some mornings, I woke up with a heaviness I couldn't name. Other days, I felt hopeful in a way that surprised me. Emotions came and went without asking permission. I was learning to observe them instead of pushing them away. That practice alone felt like a full-time job. My wife noticed the change before I did. She said I seemed more present, more willing to sit and talk without distraction. I told her I was trying. That word felt honest. Trying. Not fixing. Not perfecting. Just trying. We began taking evening walks together. Nothing special. Just around the neighborhood. At first, we spoke about practical things. Groceries. Schedules. But gradually, the conversations deepened. She shared fears she had carried quietly for years. Worries about our son. About aging. About the distance that had grown between us. I listened. Really listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't explain. I just stayed. I realized how rarely I had done that before. One night, she asked me if I ever felt angry about giving up my dreams. The question caught me off guard. I had framed my sacrifices as noble for so long that acknowledging anger felt wrong. But as I sat with the question, I felt something rise in me. Not rage. Not bitterness. Just a soft sadness mixed with resentment I had never allowed myself to feel. I admitted that sometimes I wondered who I might have been if I had made different choices. Saying it out loud felt like opening a window in a room that had been sealed for years. The air was cold and uncomfortable, but it was also fresh. She didn't judge me. She didn't rush to reassure me. She simply held my hand. That small act felt like permission to be human. As weeks turned into months, my son and I continued to exchange messages. Slowly, carefully, he shared pieces of his life away from home. New interests, new friendships, new ideas about what he wanted to pursue. I listened without correcting him, without warning him about practicality, without reminding him of responsibility. That restraint was harder than I expected. My instincts still leaned toward caution, but I remembered how my words had shaped him before. I didn't want fear to be the loudest voice in his head anymore. One day, he told me he was considering a path that felt uncertain, creative, unstable. My chest tightened instinctively. The old part of me wanted to list risks, to advise him towards safety. Instead, I asked him how it made him feel. He paused, then said it made him feel alive. That word stayed with me. Alive. I realized then that I had rarely used that word to describe my own life. Content. Stable. Responsible. Those were the words I knew. Alive felt unfamiliar, but not unreachable. I began to wonder if it was too late for me to feel that way too. At work, I found myself speaking up more. Not aggressively, just honestly. I shared ideas that reflected my interests rather than just what was expected. Some were well received. Others weren't. But each time I spoke, I felt more like myself. I remembered the young man who once sketched buildings late at night. He wasn't gone. He had just been quiet. One afternoon, a colleague asked about my interests outside of work. The question would have once made me uncomfortable. This time, I told him about architecture, about design, about the way space influences how people feel. Saying those words felt like reclaiming a part of myself I had long abandoned. I didn't plan to change careers. That wasn't realistic. But I began taking small steps. Reading again, sketching occasionally, visiting buildings I admired. These acts weren't about achievement. They were about acknowledgement. I understood then that dreams don't disappear when you give them up. They wait, sometimes patiently, sometimes painfully. Ignoring them doesn't make them go away. It just makes them quieter, heavier. My son noticed the change in me too. During one conversation, he said I sounded different. Lighter. I told him I was learning. He laughed softly and said he was too. That mutual learning became a bridge between us. We were no longer parent and child trapped in old roles. We were two people trying to understand ourselves better. There were still moments of tension, still misunderstandings. Healing was not a straight line, but the difference was in how we handled those moments. We talked. We listened. We didn't rush to defend ourselves. One evening, my son asked me if I ever wished I had encouraged him more. The honesty of the question stung. I took a long breath before answering. I told him yes, that I regretted not showing him more clearly that his thoughts mattered, that his feelings were valid. I told him I was sorry. That apology felt heavier than any word I had spoken before. It also felt necessary. He didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was calm. He said hearing that helped, that it didn't erase the past, but it changed how he carried it. After that conversation, I sat alone for a long time. I thought about how many apologies I had withheld over the years, believing that responsibility excused emotional absence. I saw now that acknowledging hurt didn't diminish my sacrifices. It honored them by making them meaningful. As time passed, I became more comfortable with uncertainty. I stopped needing everything to fit into a neat explanation. Life felt less like a problem to solve and more like a story still being written. I realized that my identity had been built almost entirely on what I did for others. Provider, protector, problem solver. Those roles mattered, but they weren't the whole picture. I was also a person with needs, regrets, and hopes. Accepting that didn't make me selfish. It made me honest. One night, as I walked through the quiet house, I paused outside my son's room. It was still empty, but it no longer felt abandoned. It felt like a chapter waiting to be revisited. I didn't know what the future held. I only knew that I was no longer afraid to face it. The space between who I was and who I was becoming was uncomfortable, uncertain, and necessary. It was a space filled with questions instead of answers, with reflection instead of routine. And in that space, I was finally learning how to live, not just endure. There was a time when I believed that understanding your mistakes meant you had failed, that if you looked back too often, you were weak or ungrateful. I carried that belief quietly for most of my life. It allowed me to move forward without stopping, without asking questions that might slow me down. But as the days passed after my son and I began speaking honestly, I realized something important. Reflection wasn't a trap. It was a doorway. I didn't wake up one morning suddenly healed or confident. Change didn't arrive with clarity or certainty. It came in fragments. In moments when I reacted differently than I used to. In pauses where I once would have filled the silence with advice or distraction. I noticed those moments more than anything else. They were small, but they felt meaningful. One afternoon, I received a message from my son asking if we could talk on the phone. The request alone made my heart beat faster. For years, our conversations had been brief and practical. This felt different. I stepped outside, sat on the back steps, and waited for the call to connect. When I heard his voice, I felt a mix of relief and tension. We spoke about simple things at first. His day, my week. Then there was a pause. In the past, I would have rushed to fill it. This time I waited. He told me he had been thinking about his childhood, about moments he remembered clearly and others that felt blurred. He said he didn't blame me for everything, but he struggled with feeling like he always had to earn approval. Hearing that hurt, even though I understood where it came from. I told him I never wanted him to feel that way. The words felt inadequate, but they were honest. He asked me if I ever felt proud of him. The question landed heavily. Of course I did. I always had. But pride, to me, had been something quiet, something assumed. I realized then how rarely I had expressed it out loud. I told him I was proud of his thoughtfulness, his kindness, his courage to step away and find himself. As I spoke, my voice wavered. I didn't try to hide it. There was another pause. This one felt softer. He thanked me, not quickly, not politely, with sincerity. After the call ended, I sat there for a long time, listening to the sounds around me. Birds, traffic in the distance, ordinary life continuing. I felt something loosen inside me. That conversation didn't fix everything, but it shifted something fundamental. It reminded me that words matter, not just actions, not just intentions. Words shape how people see themselves. I began thinking more deeply about how the past had shaped me. Not just my parenting, but my sense of self. I had spent so many years defining my worth by usefulness that I didn't know who I was without responsibility. When responsibilities eased, as they naturally do over time, I felt lost. That loss had quietly influenced how I interacted with my family. I had clung to duty because it was familiar. I realized that my sacrifices had not been meaningless. They had provided stability, safety, opportunities, but they had also become a shield, a way to avoid vulnerability. I could say, I did everything for you, without ever saying, I was afraid, or I didn't know how to show love. That distinction mattered. My wife and I continued our evening walks. Sometimes we talked about our son, sometimes about ourselves. Other times, we walked in silence, comfortable in each other's presence. That comfort was new. It came from honesty, not habit. One night, she told me she had often felt like the emotional bridge between me and our son, that she had tried to translate our love into language he could understand. Hearing that filled me with gratitude and regret. I thanked her, truly thanked her, for carrying what I could not. We talked about the future, about aging, about what we wanted our later years to feel like. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a life that wasn't only about obligation. A life that included curiosity, connection, even joy. That idea scared me more than I expected. Joy felt risky, like something that could be taken away. But I reminded myself that avoiding joy hadn't protected me from pain. It had only limited my experience of life. I started volunteering on weekends, helping with small community projects related to design and planning. Nothing ambitious, just contributing in a way that aligned with my interests. Being involved without pressure reminded me that fulfillment doesn't have to come from grand achievements. Sometimes it comes from engagement. My son visited us for the first time since he left one quiet afternoon. There was no big announcement, no dramatic reunion. He walked through the door carrying a small bag, looking older somehow, more sure of himself. We hugged awkwardly at first, then more naturally. I noticed how careful we both were with our words, like we were handling something fragile. We sat at the kitchen table, the same place where so many silent meals had passed. This time, we talked openly, about his experiences, about my reflections, about things we wished had been different. There were moments of sadness, but also moments of laughter. Real laughter, the kind that comes from shared understanding. At one point, he asked me if I ever wished I had chosen differently. The question no longer frightened me. I told him yes, sometimes. But I also told him that I didn't regret loving my family. I regretted not knowing how to love out loud. He nodded. He said he was learning how to separate responsibility from self-worth, that he didn't want to repeat the same patterns. Hearing that filled me with hope, not because he was rejecting my life, but because he was building his own with awareness. When he left that evening, the house felt quiet again, but not empty. The silence felt peaceful instead of heavy. It felt like a pause, not an absence. As days passed, I noticed how my memories of the past began to change. They no longer felt like accusations. They felt like lessons. I could look back without flinching. I could acknowledge mistakes without collapsing under their weight. I understood then that the past only becomes a prison when you refuse to learn from it, when you deny it, when you pretend it doesn't matter. Facing it didn't trap me. It freed me. I was still the same man in many ways. Practical, quiet, thoughtful. But now there was softness where there had once been rigidity. Openness where there had been control. I wasn't trying to reinvent myself. I was allowing myself to be more fully present. One evening, as I watched the sun set from the porch, I thought about the promise I had made to my son when he was born, to give him a better life. I realized that promise hadn't failed. It had evolved. A better life wasn't just about security. It was about honesty, about permission to feel, about the courage to choose meaning. The night my son walked away had felt like an ending. Now I understood it had been a beginning. A painful one, but necessary. The past no longer felt like something I needed to outrun. It was something I could carry with understanding, with compassion, with the knowledge that growth is always possible, even later in life. And for the first time in a long while, I felt at peace with the man I was becoming. After my son's visit, I noticed something subtle but important. I no longer felt the need to brace myself for every interaction. For years, I had approached conversations like negotiations, carefully weighing words, anticipating outcomes, preparing defenses. Now, I was beginning to understand that connection didn't require control. It required presence, and presence meant staying, even when discomfort surfaced. That lesson became clear during a moment I hadn't expected to matter as much as it did. A few weeks after his visit, my son called unexpectedly. There was no crisis in his voice, no urgency, just a simple call. We talked about ordinary things, the weather, a book he was reading, a project I was helping with. Then he mentioned feeling unsure about a choice he had made. Not regretful, just uncertain. In the past, uncertainty made me nervous. I would have rushed to offer reassurance or direction. I would have told him what I thought was best. This time, I resisted that urge. I asked him what part of the uncertainty bothered him most. He thought for a moment before answering. That pause felt important, like he was hearing his own thoughts more clearly. As he spoke, I listened without shaping his words into something more manageable. I stayed with the discomfort of not knowing how the conversation would end. When we hung up, I felt something new. Trust. Not just his trust in me, but my trust in the process of honest connection. That trust didn't erase fear. It coexisted with it. I began to notice how often, in the past, I had avoided staying present during emotionally charged moments. When my wife was upset, I tried to fix things quickly. When my son was quiet, I assumed he wanted space. Avoidance had felt like respect. Now I saw it had also been distance. One evening, my wife came home visibly tired. She didn't say much at first. I recognized that familiar tension in her shoulders. Instead of giving her space and retreating into my routine, I asked if she wanted to talk. She hesitated, then nodded. She spoke about feeling invisible at work, about worry she hadn't shared because she didn't want to add to my stress. As she spoke, I felt the old instinct to reassure her, to minimize the problem. I stopped myself. I listened. I stayed. When she finished, I didn't offer solutions. I told her I understood why she felt the way she did. That acknowledgement mattered more than advice ever had. Later, she told me it meant more to her than she could explain. Hearing that made me realize how rarely I had offered simple understanding, how often I had hidden behind practicality. That night, lying in bed, I thought about the years when staying emotionally present felt dangerous, when showing vulnerability felt like risking collapse. I understood now that vulnerability didn't destroy stability. It deepened it. As time went on, I found myself reflecting more on my own parents. I thought about my father and the way he carried responsibility, about the love he showed through consistency rather than affection. I used to judge him quietly for that. Now, I felt compassion. He had done what he knew, just as I had. That compassion didn't excuse the pain his distance caused, but it helped me understand the pattern. Generations passing down survival skills without teaching emotional fluency, strength without softness, endurance without expression. I realized then that breaking a pattern doesn't require blame. It requires awareness. One afternoon, I visited my father's old house, now empty and waiting to be sold. Walking through the rooms felt like stepping into memory. I could almost hear his footsteps, his quiet voice. I sat in the living room and allowed myself to feel things I had never named before. Gratitude, resentment, love, sadness. All of it existed together. I spoke out loud, even though no one was there. I told him I understood now, that I wished we had talked more, that I wished I had told him about my dreams. The words felt strange in my mouth, but necessary. That conversation, even imagined, brought a sense of closure I hadn't known I needed. After that visit, I noticed a shift in how I spoke to my son. I was less guarded, more open about my uncertainties. I told him when I didn't have answers. I admitted when I felt afraid. Those admissions didn't weaken my role as a father. They humanized it. One evening, he told me he appreciated hearing that I was still figuring things out too. He said it made him feel less pressure to have everything decided. That comment stayed with me. I realized how much unspoken expectation I had carried. Expectation that I always had to be steady, certain, strong. Letting go of that expectation felt like setting down a heavy bag I didn't realize I was carrying. I began to see how staying present required courage. Not dramatic courage, quiet courage. The courage to sit with uncertainty, to allow silence without retreat, to accept that love sometimes feels uncomfortable because it asks us to be seen. There were days when old habits resurfaced, days when I avoided conversations because I was tired or overwhelmed. I didn't shame myself for those moments. I noticed them. I tried again the next day. Progress wasn't linear. It was patient. My son and I began planning small things together. A meal, a visit, a shared project. Nothing grand, just moments of togetherness. Those plans mattered because they were intentional. They said, I am here. I will stay. One afternoon, while working on a small repair together, he asked me what I would have done differently if I could go back. The question didn't feel accusatory. It felt curious. I told him I would have spoken more, listened more. I would have told him about my fears instead of hiding them behind responsibility. I would have told him that his inner world mattered. He nodded thoughtfully. He said he hoped to do better when he had a family of his own someday. That hope felt like a quiet victory, not for me, but for the future. As I reflected on the journey so far, I realized that love isn't proven by how much you endure in silence. It's proven by how willing you are to stay engaged when things feel uncertain, by how often you choose connection over comfort. The night my son walked away had forced me to confront my patterns. This chapter of my life was teaching me something deeper. That repair isn't about grand apologies or dramatic changes. It's about consistency, about showing up again and again, about staying when it would have been easier to hide, staying with emotions I once avoided, staying present in relationships that mattered. I was still learning. I would probably always be learning. But for the first time, that didn't feel like failure. It felt like growth. And in that steady, imperfect effort, I found something I had been missing for a long time. Connection that felt real. For a long time, I believed fear came from the outside. From money problems. From illness. From losing stability. I structured my life around protecting my family from those things. I worked harder, planned further ahead, and avoided risks. I told myself that fear was something you managed with preparation. What I didn't understand was that the fear shaping my life most strongly didn't come from loss. It came from exposure. I was afraid of being seen. That realization didn't arrive all at once. It came quietly, through a series of moments that forced me to sit with myself in ways I never had before. The more present I became with my son and my wife, the harder it was to ignore that truth. Staying meant revealing parts of myself I had carefully kept hidden. Parts one wasn't sure were acceptable. One afternoon, my son and I met for lunch at a small place near his apartment. It wasn't planned far in advance. He suggested it casually, and I agreed without hesitation. That alone felt like progress. In the past, I would have checked schedules, weighed priorities, and turned it into something complicated. This time, I just went. We sat across from each other, sunlight coming through the window. He looked comfortable in his own skin in a way I never had at his age. That realization filled me with mixed emotions. Pride, yes, but also a quiet grief for the younger version of myself who never felt that ease. As we talked, he mentioned a moment from his childhood that I had completely forgotten. A time when he had asked me for help with something creative, and I had redirected him towards something more practical. He didn't accuse me. He simply stated it as a memory that had stayed with him. I felt the familiar urge to explain myself, to justify the choice, to remind him of my intentions. Instead, I asked him how it had made him feel. He said it made him feel like his interests were optional, like they mattered less than responsibility. Hearing that hurt in a way that felt clean, honest. I told him I was sorry. Not quickly, not defensively. I told him I didn't know how to encourage creativity because I had never been encouraged myself. Saying that out loud felt like admitting weakness. It also felt true. He looked at me for a long moment, then said something that stayed with me. He said, "I think you were protecting yourself, not just me." That sentence landed deeply. I realized then that my caution had not only been about fear for his future, it had been about fear of reopening my own unfulfilled desires. If I discouraged his dreams, I didn't have to confront my own. That truth followed me home that day. I sat in the living room and thought about all the times I had chosen safety over honesty. Not because I was unkind, but because I was afraid of what honesty might require of me. If I admitted my longings, I might have to grieve them properly. I might have to admit that some sacrifices had cost me more than I was willing to acknowledge. I had told myself for years that I was content, that contentment and happiness were the same thing. Now I understood they were not. Contentment can coexist with numbness. Happiness requires engagement. That night, I told my wife something I had never said before. I told her I was afraid that if I allowed myself to want more, I would feel selfish. That I worried wanting more would mean I was dissatisfied with the life we built. She listened quietly, then told me something that surprised me. She said she had always known I was holding something back. She just didn't know how to reach it. Hearing that was painful, but also clarifying. My fear of being seen had created distance not only with my son, but with my partner. I had been present physically, but guarded emotionally. Over the following weeks, I began to practice a new kind of honesty. Not dramatic confessions, just small truths. I told my wife when I felt uncertain. I told my son when I was proud, even if it felt awkward. I told myself when I was tired of pretending everything was fine. Those truths didn't destabilize my life the way I had feared. They strengthened it. One evening, my son invited me to see something he was working on. It was creative, personal, unfinished. He hesitated before showing it to me, as if waiting for judgment. I recognized that hesitation immediately. It was familiar. It was mine. I made a conscious choice in that moment. I listened. I asked questions. I resisted the urge to evaluate. When he finished, I told him what I admired about it. I didn't offer advice unless he asked. I didn't measure it against practicality. I let it exist as it was. Afterward, he told me it meant a lot that I had responded that way. He said he had expected me to redirect the conversation. That comment stayed with me. It showed me how deeply past patterns can shape expectations, even after change begins. I realized then that fear had trained me to limit not only myself, but others. Fear of disappointment, fear of instability, fear of confronting what I had lost. That fear had disguised itself as wisdom. Wisdom, I was learning, doesn't avoid discomfort. It navigates it. Around this time, I found myself thinking again about architecture, not as a career path, but as a language I still spoke internally. I noticed how buildings affected my mood, how space influenced conversation. I shared those observations with my son one afternoon. He listened with genuine interest. For the first time, I felt like I was sharing a part of myself I had never fully offered. That sharing felt vulnerable. It also felt relieving. I began to understand that the fear I had lived with wasn't fear of failure. It was fear of exposure. Fear that if I showed my full self, I might be judged, dismissed, or seen as insufficient. That fear had shaped my restraint. It had shaped my silence. Naming that fear didn't make it disappear, but it made it manageable. One day, while cleaning out old boxes, I came across a photograph of myself in my early 20s. I was smiling openly, holding a sketchbook. I stared at that image for a long time. I didn't feel regret the way I once did. I felt tenderness. That young man hadn't failed. He had adapted. He had done what he thought was right with the tools he had. I placed the photo on my desk instead of putting it away. It served as a reminder, not of what I lost, but of what still lived inside me. As my relationship with my son continued to evolve, I noticed a change in how I saw my role as a father. It was no longer about guidance alone. It was about mutual respect, about allowing him to see me as a whole person, not just an authority figure. One evening, he asked me what I feared most now. The question surprised me. I thought for a moment before answering. I told him I feared missing chances to be honest, to be present, to say what mattered before time moved on. He nodded. He said he shared that fear. That moment felt like standing on common ground. I understood then that fear isn't always something to eliminate. Sometimes it's something to listen to. It points toward what matters. It shows you where honesty is needed most. The day I finally understood what I had been afraid of wasn't dramatic. There was no single moment of clarity. It was a gradual recognition that my life had been shaped not by what I lacked, but by what I avoided feeling. And now, step by step, I was choosing differently. Not because it was easy, but because it was true. For most of my life, I thought forgiveness was something you reached, a place you arrived at after enough time had passed, after the pain had settled, after apologies had been spoken and accepted. I imagined it like a door that closed behind you, separating the past from the present. What I didn't understand was that forgiveness is not a finish line. It's a practice. And like any practice, it asks something from you every day. This understanding came to me slowly, through moments that felt ordinary on the surface, but carried quiet weight underneath. It began with a misunderstanding between my son and me. Nothing dramatic. A missed call. A delayed response. In the past, small moments like that would have grown into silence. Each of us waiting for the other to reach out. Each of us telling ourselves a story about what the delay meant. This time, I felt the old tension rise, but I didn't let it take over. When we finally spoke, I told him I had worried I'd said something wrong. He paused, then admitted he had assumed I was busy and didn't want to bother me. We both laughed softly at how familiar that pattern felt. Two people assuming distance instead of asking for clarity. That moment showed me something important. Healing doesn't erase old habits. It gives you the awareness to interrupt them. Forgiveness, I was learning, wasn't about pretending the past hadn't hurt. It was about choosing not to let old wounds decide new outcomes. That choice had to be made again and again. Around this time, my son told me something he hadn't shared before. He said there were moments growing up when he felt angry at me, but he didn't know how to express it. He felt guilty for feeling that way because he knew how hard I worked. So he turned the anger inward. Hearing that made my chest ache. I saw myself in those words. The same guilt. The same internalized pressure. I told him I wished he had felt safe enough to be angry with me. Saying that felt strange, but true. Anger, I realized, isn't the opposite of love. Silence is. We talked about how both of us had learned to minimize our own feelings to keep peace. That shared recognition felt like standing in front of a mirror together. Neither of us blamed the other. We just acknowledged the cost. After that conversation, I noticed something shift in how I remembered the past. Moments that once felt heavy began to soften. Not because they disappeared, but because they were no longer isolated. They were connected to understanding. I also began thinking more about forgiving myself. That turned out to be the harder part. I had spent years judging my choices with the clarity of hindsight, measuring my younger self against standards I hadn't known at the time. I saw now how unfair that had been. Regret can teach, but it can also punish. I had been punishing myself quietly, believing that remorse was a form of responsibility. One evening, my wife asked me why I seemed lighter lately. I told her I was learning how to put things down, not forget them, just stop carrying them so tightly. She smiled and said she could feel the difference. That comment stayed with me. It reminded me that internal changes ripple outward, even when you don't announce them. We talked about forgiveness too. She shared moments when she had felt hurt by my emotional distance, but chose to stay because she believed in the life we were building. I thanked her for that choice, not as a debt I owed, but as gratitude. There's a difference between the two. I realized then that forgiveness doesn't erase accountability. It allows accountability to exist without bitterness. As weeks passed, my son and I spent more time together, not in intense conversations, but in shared experiences. Cooking a meal, walking through a park, sitting quietly without needing to fill the space. Those moments mattered because they were unburdened. They weren't about fixing the past. They were about living in the present. One afternoon, while walking, he asked me if I ever felt resentful about how my life turned out. The question surprised me. I thought carefully before answering. I told him that resentment comes when you believe you had no choice. I had choices. They were shaped by fear and responsibility, but they were still choices. Understanding that helped me release resentment. It didn't erase sadness, but it gave it context. He nodded thoughtfully. He said he was learning to make choices with awareness instead of obligation. Hearing that felt like watching a pattern break. There were still moments when the past resurfaced unexpectedly. A comment, a memory, a tone of voice. In those moments, forgiveness felt fragile. I had to remind myself that healing wasn't about never feeling hurt again. It was about responding differently when hurt appeared. One night, alone in the house, I revisited old journals I had kept sporadically over the years. They were filled with practical notes, to-do lists, work concerns, very little emotion. Reading them felt like observing a man who was always moving forward, rarely pausing to ask how he felt. Instead of judging those pages, I felt compassion. That man had been doing his best. He had believed that silence was strength, that endurance was love. He hadn't known another way. I wrote a new entry that night. Not long, just a few sentences. I wrote about learning to forgive without forgetting, about choosing presence over protection, about understanding that love doesn't require perfection. It requires honesty. That act felt symbolic, not because it changed anything externally, but because it marked a shift internally. As my relationship with my son continued to deepen, I noticed how often he checked in emotionally. He asked how I was really doing. At first, I gave careful answers. Over time, I became more open. I told him when I felt tired, when I felt hopeful, when I felt unsure. Sharing those things didn't burden him. It connected us. One evening, he told me he forgave me. Not as a dramatic declaration, just a simple statement. I felt gratitude, but I also felt something else. Responsibility. Forgiveness, I understood, wasn't something to accept and move on from. It was something to honor through action. I told him I didn't take his forgiveness lightly, that I saw it as an invitation to keep showing up honestly. He said that was all he wanted. That exchange clarified something important. Forgiveness isn't a gift you receive and store away. It's a relationship you maintain. I also began to forgive my father in a deeper way, not by excusing his limitations, but by understanding them. I could see now how his life had shaped him, how his silence had been learned, not chosen freely. That understanding didn't erase the distance between us. It transformed it. I visited his grave one quiet afternoon. I didn't bring flowers. I didn't rehearse a speech. I just stood there and spoke honestly. I told him I was trying to do better, to break patterns, to speak where he had been silent. That moment felt grounding, like closing a circle. Forgiveness, I realized, isn't about rewriting history. It's about changing how history lives inside you. As part 8 of this journey unfolded, I no longer felt like I was chasing resolution. I was practicing acceptance of myself, of my family, of the imperfect way love moves through generations. The night my son walked away had cracked something open. What followed wasn't a straight path to healing. It was a winding road filled with reflection, discomfort, and growth. Forgiveness didn't arrive as a single moment of peace. It arrived as a series of choices. To listen, to stay, to speak honestly, to let the past inform the present without controlling it. And in those choices, I found something steadier than relief. I found understanding. The months after our conversations with my son grew deeper felt like navigating a new landscape. Not a landscape of grand gestures or dramatic revelations, but of quiet, steady work. I realized that family isn't something that exists because you share a roof or a last name. It exists because you engage, because you choose, day after day, to be present, emotionally, mentally, physically. For years, I had measured my role as a father by doing, providing, shielding, organizing. I believed that love could be proven by action alone, that my sacrifices would speak louder than any word. But silence had a weight I hadn't accounted for. Absence of words can feel like absence of care. My son had felt that weight, and only when we began speaking honestly did I see how heavy it had been. I started small, simple things. Eating dinner together at the table without distractions. Sitting through a movie he chose instead of picking one I liked. Listening to his music, even when it was loud and unfamiliar. Those moments felt mundane, yet they carried a subtle significance. Presence in the ordinary was slowly rebuilding trust. One evening, my son mentioned that he had been hesitant to invite me to a small gathering with his friends. He wasn't angry or dramatic about it. He was careful, reflective. He said he wanted to make sure I understood who he was now, separate from the boy I remembered. That statement cut deep. It reminded me how much time we had lost to distance, how much he had grown in spaces I hadn't seen. I told him I understood, that I wanted to see the person he had become, that I was proud of him, not for what he achieved, but for who he was. He smiled. It was quiet, but it carried warmth I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't easy. Old habits die slowly. I noticed how quickly my mind would drift back to my own assumptions, to judgments about what was practical or safe, to fears of making the wrong choice. I reminded myself to pause, to listen, to stay. The pause became my practice. The staying became my discipline. Around the same time, my wife shared her own reflections. She told me she realized that part of her patience with me had been an effort to shield the family from my silence. She had carried unspoken concerns for years, hoping to smooth over the cracks I didn't see. Hearing that, I felt guilt, but I also felt gratitude. She had been quietly holding us together, even as I was learning the same lesson about presence and listening. We began talking about the future in ways we hadn't before. Not just about schedules or bills, but about dreams, hopes, regrets. About what we wanted to teach our son through our example, not our words alone. The conversations were tentative at first, but gradually they became natural. We discovered a shared desire to be more fully human together, to allow vulnerability and honesty into our family life. I noticed changes in the way I approached discipline and guidance with my son. In the past, I had relied on instruction and expectation. Now, I asked questions. I offered options. I listened. I let him make mistakes and take responsibility, but I stayed nearby to offer support when he needed it. That shift was subtle, but it transformed the way we interacted. He responded with trust rather than rebellion. He shared fears rather than hiding them. He invited me into his life, instead of guarding it. One weekend, he asked if I would help him with a project he had been working on, a model for a small design he was creating. As we worked side by side, I noticed how naturally he had developed his own process, his own methods. I resisted the urge to correct or instruct. Instead, I offered perspective when asked. We laughed at mistakes, celebrated small victories. I realized that being a part of his life now meant supporting him as an equal in curiosity and creativity, not simply as the parent who knows best. During those weeks, I also reflected on my own dreams, the ones I had set aside for my family. Architecture, design, building spaces that felt alive. I began exploring them quietly again, sketching late at night, visiting local structures with curiosity rather than duty. I noticed how invigorating it felt to reclaim that part of myself, not as a competition with my responsibilities, but as a complement. My son noticed too. He asked about the drawings. We discussed ideas openly. That dialogue felt like healing, a bridge spanning decades of unspoken desires. One afternoon, we went to a small park. It was quiet, empty enough to feel private. He asked me if I remembered the afternoons he had spent building forts in the backyard as a boy. I laughed softly. I said I did, though I had been preoccupied with work at the time. He said he remembered me watching quietly from the porch, never joining, never guiding, just observing. I felt a pang of regret, but I also smiled at the memory. Observation can be a form of care, I told him. He nodded thoughtfully. We spent that afternoon talking about everything and nothing. About mistakes we had made. About dreams still waiting. About fear and courage. About love. I realized then that family isn't a series of accomplishments or obligations. It's the willingness to meet each other where we are, repeatedly, even when the past is heavy and imperfect. Evenings at home became more reflective. We cooked together, laughed together, shared small routines that seemed ordinary but now carried a new intimacy. I noticed how often my wife would glance at us with quiet satisfaction, as if to say, "This is what I hoped for." And for the first time, I understood that building a family isn't just about shelter and provision. It's about connection, presence, attention to the life you're sharing. There were still challenges. Tensions would flare. Old misunderstandings surfaced unexpectedly, but I had learned a different way to respond. I listened first. I waited. I acknowledged feelings. I chose patience over reaction. That choice changed the way conflict felt. It became an opportunity for understanding, rather than a measure of failure. I also realized that reliving the past in conversation with my son or wife didn't reopen wounds the way I feared. It gave them context. It made unspoken frustrations visible. It created a language for connection. Slowly, we were learning to translate the unexpressed into conversation, to build bridges over years of distance. The night my son walked away had been a rupture. It felt like loss, like punishment, like a door closing. Now, years later, I saw it differently. It had been an invitation, not to blame, not to despair, but to learn, to stay, to engage fully, to rebuild, and most importantly, to grow, not just for him or my wife, but for myself. I noticed that in embracing presence, I also embraced curiosity about my son, about my wife, about the world, about myself. I was no longer content to simply endure life. I wanted to understand it, to participate in it, to be active emotionally in the life I had once navigated with detachment. One evening, I watched my son working on a personal project at the kitchen table. He paused, looked at me, and asked for my thoughts. I gave them honestly, not as instruction, not as judgment, but as sharing. He smiled, then returned to his work. That simple interaction struck me profoundly. It was ordinary, but it was also everything. It reflected trust, understanding, and the quiet intimacy of connection. That night, I realized a deeper truth. Family is not a static entity. It is a living, evolving network of relationships. Each choice to listen, to stay present, to share honestly, builds it stronger. Each moment of withdrawal, of silence, of unspoken regret, can weaken it. I had spent decades swinging between those extremes. Now, I was learning how to tip the scale toward presence consistently. The house felt lighter than it had in years. Not because the past had disappeared, but because it was understood. The weight of silence had lifted. The tension of unspoken regrets had eased. And in that space, connection could breathe. As I reflected on these months, I saw how the hardest lessons had become the most rewarding. Presence over avoidance. Listening over judging. Engagement over retreat. Patience over expectation. Honesty over performance. And I began to understand, more fully than ever, what it truly meant to be a family. It isn't a role you play. It isn't a duty you perform. It isn't a measure of sacrifices made. It is an ongoing commitment to meet each other in truth, with attention, care, and willingness to stay, even when it is uncomfortable. The night my son walked away had felt like an ending. In truth, it had been a beginning of learning how to stay, how to listen, how to forgive, how to be human together. And in that effort, I finally began to feel the slow, steady rhythm of family. Not perfect, not easy, but real. It was late autumn when the moment came that would change my understanding of life, love, and family forever. I didn't know it at the time. Nothing in the day had suggested anything unusual. I had worked a regular day, come home to the quiet house, and settled into my evening routine. My son had been visiting for a few hours earlier, leaving to meet friends. My wife was upstairs reading. Everything felt ordinary. And yet, by the end of that night, nothing would feel the same again. It started with a phone call, the kind that makes your chest tighten even before you hear a voice. My sister was on the line, her voice trembling. There had been an accident, a minor car collision. Nothing life-threatening, she said quickly, but her tone betrayed more than her words. I felt my stomach drop. Not for myself, not immediately. For my son. I knew how quickly life could shift, how fragile things we took for granted really were. I drove to where he had been. My hands gripped the wheel tightly, knuckles white. Every red light, every turn, every moment of waiting stretched time in a way I had never experienced before. By the time I arrived, a crowd had gathered, but he was standing, dazed but unharmed. Relief hit like a tidal wave. I grabbed his shoulder instinctively, unable to speak. My voice failed me. He looked at me, confusion in his eyes, and I realized in that instant how vulnerable we all were, despite our careful planning and measured lives. The night stretched on, full of quiet reflection. When we got home, we didn't speak much. Words felt inadequate. I noticed the tension in his posture, the way he avoided my gaze, the subtle trembling of hands that had just steered through a life-threatening moment. I sat beside him and held his hand. No words, just presence. That night, presence became more important than explanation, more important than advice, more important than reassurance. As he slowly relaxed, I realized that life had a way of reminding us how precious connection is, how quickly it can slip away. I thought of the years we had spent distant, the years I had assumed that love could be proven by doing, by protecting, by giving stability. None of that mattered in a moment like this. Only the willingness to be there, to stay, to witness. The days that followed were quiet but profound. We didn't need to talk about the accident. We just existed alongside each other, eating together, watching television, sharing simple conversations. The ordinary became sacred. I saw it with clarity now. Love isn't always the grand gesture or the heroic intervention. Sometimes, love is holding a hand through fear. Sometimes, love is sitting quietly while the other person processes their trauma. Sometimes, love is staying when you might otherwise flee into distraction or comfort. That week, I began to notice how my own fears had shaped my life. The fear of inadequacy, the fear of failing as a parent, the fear of my own dreams unfulfilled. They had quietly dictated every interaction, every withheld word, every precaution I had taken. I realized that I had often mistaken fear for responsibility, and in doing so, I had distanced myself from the very people I was trying to protect. I spent long nights thinking about how I could live differently, how I could embody presence, courage, and love simultaneously. It wasn't easy. Old habits die slowly. I noticed myself slipping back into control, into planning, into advice-giving, even when it wasn't necessary. And each time, I caught myself, paused, and chose a different path. I chose listening. I chose patience. I chose to be present without trying to fix everything. One evening, my son came to me, uncharacteristically quiet. He sat beside me and asked about my younger years, about my dreams, about moments I had given up. He wanted to know who I was before life demanded that I be practical, steady, and dependable. His curiosity wasn't accusatory. It wasn't judgmental. It was open, honest, and tender. I realized in that moment how rarely I had shared that side of myself, how rarely I had allowed anyone to see the private corners of my heart. I told him stories I had never spoken aloud, about the sketches I had abandoned, about nights spent imagining buildings that might never exist, about the fear I had carried, hidden behind responsibility. As I spoke, I noticed him leaning closer, listening, understanding, accepting. And in that moment, I understood something vital. Connection requires vulnerability. You cannot build bridges with walls. You cannot love fully with silence. In the following weeks, we began a new routine, not out of obligation, not out of guilt, but because it felt necessary. Breakfast together, walks after work, conversations that were unstructured, free-flowing, and emotionally honest. I listened to his doubts. He listened to mine. We shared grief, joy, fear, and hope. The unspoken gaps that had separated us began to narrow, not through words alone, but through presence, through shared life. My wife observed these changes quietly, often remarking later how she felt the household had shifted, how the energy felt lighter, how our son seemed more willing to engage, more willing to confide. I realized that the healing wasn't just between me and him. It was radiating outward. It was transforming the family's emotional climate. Around that time, I faced another internal reckoning. I reflected on my own father, and on the ways he had shown love, mostly through provision and stoicism. I understood now that I had inherited patterns of emotional distance, of silence, of indirect care. But I also realized I didn't need to repeat them. Presence, honesty, vulnerability, they were choices I could make differently. One late night, I found myself sketching again. Not for a career, not for recognition, but simply to reconnect with a part of myself I had abandoned. I noticed how the act of creation mirrored my interactions with my son, attentive, patient, honest. Not hurried, not perfection-seeking, not performed for approval. Just presence, just engagement. Weeks later, my son approached me with a small gift. Nothing elaborate, just a notebook with a sketch he had been working on. "I thought you might like this," he said, his voice steady but shy. I looked at the sketches and felt something I had long forgotten. Awe, not only at his talent, but at his willingness to share a piece of himself. I thanked him, truly, deeply, not just for the sketches, but for trusting me enough to show them. The shift in our relationship was subtle but undeniable. The old roles of authority and obedience, of expectation and caution, were giving way to mutual respect and understanding. I was no longer only a father instructing a child. I was a fellow human being navigating life's uncertainties alongside another. By winter, I realized something profound. Life isn't a series of guarantees. It isn't a ledger of right choices and sacrifices. It's a series of moments, small, fleeting, often ordinary, that accumulate into meaning. The night of the accident reminded me that presence, vulnerability, and honesty matter far more than perfection, control, or distance. I began to embrace imperfection in myself and others. I allowed my son to make mistakes without immediate correction. I allowed myself to fail emotionally without judgment. I listened without offering solutions. I spoke without overthinking consequences. And in these choices, our family grew stronger, more authentic, more alive. One evening, I sat by the window, watching snow fall silently outside. My son was upstairs, my wife beside me. The quiet was no longer heavy. It was full of connection, full of understanding, full of life. I reflected on how far we had come, from distance to dialogue, from fear to presence, from obligation to authenticity. And I understood something I had never fully grasped before. Family is not a prize to earn. It's not a responsibility to fulfill. It is a living, breathing practice of staying, listening, loving, and being honest. The night of fear and uncertainty had been a reminder, a lesson, a turning point, and I vowed never to forget it. From that moment on, every choice I made, every conversation, every touch, every act of presence, was a conscious decision to honor life and family as they existed, imperfect and real. I realized that love, presence, and connection are not guaranteed by circumstance. They are chosen, every day, every moment. And in that choosing, I found peace. Not perfect peace, not permanent peace, but a steady, quiet, human peace that felt like home. The months that followed the night of the accident were not dramatic, but they were transformative. Life has a way of teaching its deepest lessons quietly, often in ordinary moments that go unnoticed until you reflect. I began to understand that the process of healing, rebuilding, and reconnecting is not linear. It is a series of small choices, repeated over time, until the cumulative effect becomes undeniable. Winter settled into our town with its long nights and crisp air. Inside, our home began to feel different. Not brighter, not bigger, but warmer. Not because of lights or heat, but because of presence, because of attention, because of the effort we all were putting into being seen, heard, and understood. I started to notice my own patterns more clearly. How often I had spoken without listening. How often I had assumed understanding instead of seeking it. How often I had equated doing with loving. And how often I had hidden vulnerability behind practicality. One morning, my son came into the kitchen with a cup of coffee he had made himself. He set it on the table beside me, smiled, and said, "Thought you might need this." The gesture was simple, unremarkable in isolation, yet it felt monumental. It was the quiet fruit of weeks of effort, weeks of showing up, listening, being present, being honest. I thanked him sincerely, not just for the coffee, but for the intention behind it, for showing me that small acts carry weight when they are offered from the heart. As the days passed, I began sharing more of myself with my son, not just stories of the past, but current thoughts, dreams, and even fears. I told him when I felt unsure, when I worried about the future, when I doubted my own abilities. In return, he shared with me in ways he never had before, trusting that I could hold his vulnerabilities without judgment. That mutual trust transformed the way we related. Our conversations became a safe space, where honesty was not punished but received with care. One afternoon, we worked together on a small home project, rebuilding a part of the porch that had weakened over the years. I showed him techniques I had learned in my early career. He suggested improvements of his own. At first, I felt the instinct to correct, to assert authority, but I stopped myself. I listened. I observed. I encouraged. The collaboration became a metaphor for everything I was learning. Guidance without control, presence without domination, love without performance. During this period, I also began to write again. Sketches, notes, reflections, sometimes plans for small architectural projects. I didn't aim for accomplishment or recognition. I aimed for expression. I realized that creativity and presence are deeply intertwined. To create is to engage with life honestly, to be vulnerable, to be seen, even if only by oneself. My wife and I deepened our connection as well. She had been my quiet anchor for years, but now our conversations felt lighter, more intentional. We spoke of our hopes, regrets, and dreams with honesty. We shared fears that had once gone unspoken. We laughed more freely. We paused together, absorbing the quiet moments, letting them speak. I noticed how our interactions began to model for our son what a healthy, engaged partnership could look like: respect, presence, patience, and shared vulnerability. Spring arrived, and with it came a subtle shift. The long winter nights had offered reflection. The cold had forced inwardness. And now, growth was visible. My son's demeanor shifted in small ways. More confidence, more openness, less hesitance to share his thoughts. Our shared projects became more ambitious: designs for a small garden, plans for minor home renovations. And every act, every plan, every conversation carried with it the imprint of weeks of intentional effort. Showing up, listening, staying present. I realized then that parenthood is not about perfection, but about consistency. Consistency in attention, in presence, in honesty. My son had not needed grand gestures. He had needed me to stay, over and over, through ordinary and extraordinary moments alike. He had needed me to witness his growth without trying to control it, to guide without dominating, to love without performance. One evening, he asked me why I had stayed after he walked away years ago. The memory of that night still ached, but I told him honestly, because even in distance, I couldn't stop caring. I knew that leaving wouldn't solve anything, and I realized later that staying, being present, being patient, was the only way to truly rebuild what had been broken. He listened quietly, then said, "I think I understand now. It's not about being perfect. It's about showing up." I smiled. That simple sentence encapsulated so much of what I had learned. Love is not an abstract concept. Connection is not something you achieve once and assume you have. Family is not a static entity. It is the sum of repeated choices to show up, to stay, to listen, to forgive, to engage. Over the following months, I noticed subtle changes in myself. I was less reactive. I listened more. I was patient with mistakes, my own and others. I expressed pride and affection without waiting for milestones. I allowed myself to feel sadness without letting it dominate. I allowed joy without guilt. I learned to balance responsibility with presence, to hold space without trying to control it. Our home became a laboratory for presence. Every meal, every conversation, every shared task was an experiment in attentive engagement. Sometimes we failed. Sometimes we fell back into old patterns. But each misstep became a chance to practice again, to choose differently, to recommit to presence and honesty. I began noticing the impact on my son in ways I hadn't anticipated. He spoke more freely of his dreams. He laughed more openly. He included me in decisions, not because he needed guidance, but because he trusted me as a partner in thought and action. I realized then that connection and trust cannot be rushed or forced. They are earned slowly, nurtured patiently, and reinforced through consistent presence. One afternoon, we walked through a local park together. He paused to examine the design of a small bridge, commenting on its structure, materials, and balance. I realized I was seeing him not as a child or student, but as a fellow thinker, a fellow observer of the world. The pride I felt was quiet but immense. Not because he was perfect, not because he succeeded, but because he had grown into a thoughtful, engaged human being, and I had the privilege of witnessing him. As the seasons turned, I began to write reflections in journals again. Not grand philosophical treatises, not professional blueprints, but personal reflections on what it meant to stay, to listen, to show up. I wrote about fear, about vulnerability, about forgiveness, about love. I wrote about presence. And I realized that these reflections were not just for me. They were a legacy, a quiet record of what it meant to choose connection over avoidance, to choose love over distance. One quiet evening, my wife and I sat together on the porch, watching the sunset. The sky was painted with soft oranges and pinks. I felt a profound gratitude for the ordinary moments, for the routine gestures, for the shared silences that had become sacred. I thought of my father, of my son, of myself. I understood then that family, presence, and love are not about perfection. They are about choosing, again and again, to be present, to listen, to forgive, to to connect. I realized that I had spent much of my life equating sacrifice with love. But now I understood that true love is not just sacrifice. It is presence. It is engagement. It is vulnerability. It is the willingness to stand beside those you love, not because you have to, but because you choose to every day, in small ways and large. That night, I felt a quiet peace settle over me. Not a fleeting relief, not an escape from reality, but a deep, steady sense of alignment with what truly mattered. I understood, finally, that the night my son walked away had not been an ending. It had been a turning point, a lesson in presence, patience, forgiveness, and connection. A reminder that family is built not in perfection, but in the repeated, intentional choices to show up fully, honestly, and vulnerably. And in that understanding, I found a sense of purpose and calm I had never known before. As the years unfolded after that pivotal night, I began to see my life with a clarity I had never experienced before. Not because everything had been perfect, but because I had learned to embrace imperfection fully. I had learned that life doesn't hand out guarantees, that relationships aren't owed, and that love isn't measured by the sacrifices we make or the effort we hide. Love, I came to understand, is measured by presence, by showing up fully, consistently, and vulnerably, even when it's difficult, even when it hurts, even when fear whispers that it's safer to withdraw. By this stage, my son and I had developed a rhythm. Not a perfect one, not without conflict, but a rhythm of mutual respect, trust, and engagement. I had stopped seeing myself as the sole authority in his life and started seeing him as a fellow human being navigating the same complexities of the world, just a generation younger. This shift changed everything. I listened more than I spoke. I guided only when asked. I shared my own fears and mistakes openly. I allowed him to lead, to fail, to rise again. And in return, he trusted me with his authentic self. That trust was a treasure beyond words. My wife became my anchor and my mirror. Together, we explored the dynamics of our family with honesty and compassion. We spoke about the past without blame, about regrets without shame, about hopes without pressure. We celebrated progress, however small, and we confronted old patterns without judgment. I realized that partnership isn't about perfection or avoidance of conflict. It is about shared commitment, choosing, every day, to nurture understanding, patience, and connection. One evening, after a particularly long day of work and minor household projects, my son sat beside me and said, "I think I finally understand why you stayed." I looked at him and nodded silently, giving him space to continue. He said, "Because even when things were hard, you didn't leave. You were always here, even when I didn't notice it." I felt a lump in my throat. There it was, the essence of all that had transpired. Staying, choosing presence, was the single most powerful thing a parent can do. That moment crystallized a lesson I had been learning slowly over years. That presence is the foundation for trust, forgiveness, and growth. The night he walked away had forced me to confront my own fears, patterns, and limitations. But the years that followed taught me that showing up is an ongoing process. It is not a one-time act, not a symbolic gesture, not a perfect performance. It is a commitment. It is discipline. It is the quiet, consistent effort to be there, to witness, to listen, to forgive, and to love. I began to see how much I had learned about forgiveness, not just forgiving others, but forgiving myself. I had carried guilt for years, for missed moments, for opportunities lost, for choices I had made with the best intentions but imperfect outcomes. Slowly, I learned that guilt doesn't serve anyone. Reflection and accountability do. Acknowledging mistakes, taking responsibility, and then moving forward with conscious intention, that is what matters. Forgiveness, then, is a practice, not a final destination. It is the decision to release the hold of the past so you can engage fully in the present. I also noticed a remarkable shift in how I perceived fear. For decades, I had allowed fear to dictate my choices. Fear of inadequacy, fear of failure, fear of exposure. Fear had shaped my interactions with my son, my wife, and even myself. But now I saw fear differently. Fear is not a signal to withdraw. It is a guidepost, pointing toward areas where honesty, courage, and presence are needed most. It is in the spaces where fear exists that connection deepens. The night my son walked away had been a confrontation with fear, and choosing presence in that moment had altered the trajectory of our lives. The quiet power of presence became a central theme in our family. We no longer waited for dramatic events to remind us to connect. We built rituals, shared meals without screens, intentional conversations about feelings and experiences, walks that became opportunities to explore both the world and our own thoughts. We celebrated small achievements and expressed gratitude openly. We learned to pause, listen, and acknowledge each other's perspectives before reacting. These simple practices transformed our relationships. I began to notice the subtle ripple effects. My son approached his friendships differently. He communicated with empathy. He shared openly, but also listened deeply. He reflected before reacting. He understood that relationships require effort, patience, and honesty. And he carried these lessons not as obligations, but as natural extensions of what he had observed and experienced within our family. My reflections on life grew deeper, too. I revisited the dreams I had set aside, architecture, design, creative expression, and approached them without the pressure of achievement or recognition. I began creating again, quietly, authentically, for the sake of expression and presence. That practice mirrored what I had learned with my family. Life is richer when engaged fully, when we participate honestly, and when we honor our own desires alongside our responsibilities to others. I realized that the night my son walked away had been a catalyst for a larger transformation. It forced me to confront the ways I had been absent, not physically, but emotionally. It revealed the patterns of fear, avoidance, and silence that had shaped my interactions for decades. It demanded that I choose differently. And those choices, small, consistent, intentional, had rebuilt trust, deepened connection, and fostered a more authentic family life. One winter evening, as I sat by the window watching snow fall softly, I reflected on the journey. I thought of my father and the ways he had expressed love through stoicism and provision. I thought of the years I had spent emulating, resisting, and ultimately learning from those patterns. I thought of my son and how our relationship had evolved from distance to dialogue, from fear to trust, from avoidance to presence. And I thought of my wife, whose patience and understanding had held the family together while I learned the lessons I needed most. I understood then that life's true lessons are rarely obvious. They arrive disguised as challenges, as losses, as ordinary moments infused with subtle significance. They are revealed when we pause, when we reflect, when we allow ourselves to be present with what is happening, rather than what we fear might happen. They are revealed when we choose connection over comfort, honesty over appearance, engagement over withdrawal. As I looked back, I could see that every struggle, every moment of fear or doubt, every period of distance had led to this. A family that was not perfect, but fully present. A son who trusted me with his vulnerabilities. A wife who shared her life with honesty and courage. And a man who had learned that love is not measured by sacrifice alone, but by the quiet, consistent practice of presence. The final lesson was clear. We do not choose the challenges that come our way, but we do choose how we respond. We do not control the unfolding of life, but we do control our engagement with it. We cannot guarantee perfect outcomes, but we can guarantee effort, attention, and presence. And in that commitment, we discover the depth of connection, the power of forgiveness, and the quiet joy of living authentically with those we love. I realized that the night my son walked away was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of a lifelong practice. A practice of showing up, of listening, of forgiving, of loving fully, without pretense or expectation. And in that practice, we find meaning, healing, and a life that feels deeply, quietly, profoundly alive. Now, when I look at my family, the smiles, the conversations, the small gestures that fill our days, I see a life rebuilt not through perfection, but through patience. Not through grand statements, but through consistent action. Not through control, but through presence. And I know, without doubt, that this is the life we choose.